think it's recording. Okay, so welcome everyone to tonight. The first thing will be just to open this up for everyone. I've got a bunch of different ways here that you can garden. If anyone wants to chat about maybe the garden that they're planning on having, maybe the garden they've had in the past. Just real quick, if any of these words that are on the screen resonate with you or interest you or things that you're planning on, please share so that we know how to continue this discussion tonight. So I can start. We have 3 raised beds and a ground garden, and they're mostly vegetable gardens, and I don't have a lot of luck with flower gardening. I've always wanted to do a sensory garden, so I plant things here and there so the kids can walk around and rub their fingers between the leaves and smell their fingers. So like mints and basils and things like that, lamb's ears, prickly kind of plants. But I don't have a really designated area for that. I'd love to do a dye garden sometime, but I want to do that on more land. I want to do a lot of gardening, all of these
What's a
gardens.
dye garden?
So a dye garden is you plant plants there that you can use for dyeing like clothes and or anything. Like goldenrod is a really great plant that will turn your whatever you're trying to dye gold. Paper, you could dye paper. A lot of times they're plants that are outsourced, like indigo and madder root. I don't know a whole bunch about it, especially native plants to here specifically. I think we're in zone 5A in Michigan, but they're plants that are used. A dye garden has plants that are used for the purpose of dyeing things.
Okay, yeah, beets came to mind for me.
Beets, yes, there you go. Beets. I had beets in the vegetable broth I made today and it all turned purple. That is a perfect thing in your dye garden. Hey, we have people in the chat. Backyard flower, hopefully herb and some veggies, interested in a container garden. Yeah. I have a raised garden that's designated, this year I'll designate it specifically to herb gardens. Herbs are really good to grow in containers and they can be planted closer together. So that's really nice. Yeah, Sarah, that's a good question. Sarah has a veggie garden, but would love to know of good native plants for wet, flooded, and shady areas. So I did try and do a type of, Sarah, you probably know more than I do about plants. However, I did try and do like a rain garden last year. We have an area on the side of the house that we added a patio to, but there's a gutter on the side right next to the area. And so I put like rocks there and put a gutter extension so that the water doesn't go right next to the house, but I put rocks down a path that led to a larger flower bed. It's actually underneath my pine tree, so it's really acidic and not the greatest place, but I wanted the concept of a rain garden where using the rainwater from the gutter system to go to and hydrate or water a little area there, so that it's not specifically it would be more like a wet flooded. Yeah, it is a wet flooded shady area. Yeah, that would be if anyone has any tips on some plants that are good for wet flooded and shady areas, let us know. Yeah, I do put I have irises that are growing there. Sarah asked, you put plants there, or is it, or just end it at the pine? I have irises growing there. I can't kill irises, so I kind of put them everywhere because I also think they're beautiful. But I don't know what else to put there, so I'm kind of in the same boat. Amy says her herbs always die. What kind of herbs are you planting? Does anyone else have an herb garden? So, I moved my basil. I had Thai basil and sweet basil, and I moved both of those in. I moved both of those in the winter, and they're surviving. There's a Thai basil plant back there. I started with like 20 Thai basil plants inside the house, and I think I'm down to 2 that survived, and I'm surprised that those 2 survived. And my sweet basil plant's really woody and leggy, but it's got about 15 leaves on it or so. I tend to have luck with basil, so we'll get into that. Let's see what this first slide is while I continue talking. So your herbs die. We'll talk about soil because soil is really important. Soil is like the foundation for your plants. And if your soil isn't great or the right, your plants usually need nitrogen, potassium, or phosphorus, depending on the type of plants. And if you don't have that's getting really technical. If you don't have the right combination, then your plants will not grow as big. Their roots might not be as successful. Typically things like the mint and oregano, that surprises me because those are quite invasive. But I talked to Sarah about this. My mint isn't as invasive as I would like for it to be. So I have a little bit of an issue with that too, but I don't plant it in an area where I tend to the soil. So that makes a difference. My oregano is inside of my garden where I adjust the soil every year. So I know that so that does pretty well and it comes back every year. That's a perennial. So you plant them in containers. We'll talk about soil and see if you can get your soil combination right and hopefully have better luck this year. For the mint and oregano, see if you're local, you can totally get some oregano from me. I don't mind sharing that, but those are mint and oregano are things that people will happily share. Basil, I always plant from seed, and I'm pretty good at it's pretty good at staying alive for me. Cilantro, I have some issues with that. So that's my personal that's my personal experience with that. So you're welcome. So tools, I don't have any kind of tools that are super important. The most important tools, I think, are my hands. I can do without pretty much everything else. A metal rake is probably the next most important thing, because every year I add, I think the next slide is soil. I add a combination of things to my soil to make it grow, to make the plants grow, to fertilize it. I do organic gardening, so I don't add any chemicals or anything to my soil. But I do add like peat moss and a top layer of soil and compost. We have a couple compost bins, so it's really important that we have a rake to rake in all of that new kind of nourishing stuff to the soil and mix it in with that top layer. There's a lot of controversy on using a rototiller. We do have a rototiller. I have used it in my ground bed, but the issue with that is you don't want it going in and breaking up the deep layers of the soil, because when you really cultivate the soil and add your peat moss and your organic fertilizer and your compost, you're creating a kind of biome in there of living organisms that are helping to get your plants to grow big and healthy. It's like a whole ecosystem there. So it's really important that you don't break it up and mess it up. You just want to rake it into the top layer so that it could, the organisms that are the good organisms that are in there will slowly integrate with the top layer that you add each season. So that's the issue with the rototiller. A rake is better. So that's probably my most important tool. I do use a shovel, a hand shovel, but I really prefer to use my hands instead. Yeah, I prepare the soil in the raised garden bed. I prepare the soil in the ground bed, in the raised bed, and in the containers. And let's see, I think the next slide is, okay, let's skip to soil. So here's soil. We'll go back to location. Everything is going back to soil right now. So for the soil, I use what I have for the ground soil. The ground soil, what you have is dirt. So that's what you're starting with. Soil is when you mix everything together and you're creating that really nourishing mixture. That's what soil is. Dirt is just the crumbly stuff that's there. So in order to create the really good soil, I mix, you can mix topsoil. I mix what I already have out there. So anything like that. I try not to buy if I don't have to. I'm big on using what you have. I always get Canadian peat moss. There's Michigan peat moss, but I always get Canadian peat moss. I learned a lot of, I did learn a lot from you, Mom, but I learned a lot of my gardening tips from a friend of mine that I taught with his wife. And so I learned a lot from Marty. This is how he did his soil. He said that Canadian peat moss is the best. So I go with what Marty says. So I go to, I get like the huge square of Canadian peat moss. I think it's like 3.8 cubic feet of Canadian peat moss. And I get like 3 big cubes every year. And our garden bed our garden area is about 20, maybe it's like 200 square feet, maybe. Is that right? It's something like that. We have 3 large beds and 1 long ground bed, but then I use it for containers and things like that around the house too. So anyway, I like to have some peat moss on hand just for mixing things together. So I have my peat moss, my soil, my compost that I make. I have 2 compost bins and I stir it up. Side note for compost, if you don't compost, then and you want to, there's an app called Share Waste. It's also a website, Share Waste. You can go on there and search where there's a place to compost or a house to compost nearby. So that's a way that you can compost. They're just regular people. I'm on there. I have one of my compost bins right next to the road, so you can just dump it and go. But there's a lot of, you can lay down the rules, like what you can compost and what you can't compost, so that you get the stuff that you want in your compost bin. And then I would connect with that person that you're contributing compost to and see if they'll give you some of their compost when they're turning it, or when spring or summer comes. That's what I often do. Yeah, that's what I often do. There's a couple people that put their compost in my bin, and one of them always brings their big garbage can in the springtime, and she helps me turn the compost, and we fill up her garbage can with the compost, and that's it. So Share Waste is super awesome. I'm in Jenison, so I'm sure there's something in the Wyoming Granville area. If not, Jenison is nearby. So we've got dirt, compost, peat moss, and then I use a Spoma garden tone is what I use as a fertilizer. That's a good basic kind of fertilizer. I use it for all of my beds. In my tomato bed, I do add tomato tone to it. We're getting really sciencey when we start talking about the different fertilizers, because again, that's the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It's potassium, right? Combination. There's 3 numbers with dashes in between them on the fertilizer bags, and that's what those refer to. On the side or back of the bag, it'll tell you what those numbers mean. I put some, I can't remember what it is now. It's not alfalfa. I put, there's something, I planted 70 garlic bulbs last fall, and I put a certain fertilizer in addition to my other fertilizer into that bed, because it helps with bulb or root development. And that's really important when you're planting a crop in, like I planted that crop in the fall where it had to develop, and then it would hibernate during the winter, and then now it's popping out of the ground. So that's really beneficial for those kind of root veggies. So Sarah asked, how do you layer thickness order? So I eyeball everything. It'll tell you on the back of the garden tone how much to put per square foot. So I kind of guesstimate with that. When I'm working with my garden beds or my ground garden in particular, I take about, so my raised beds are 12 feet long by 4 feet wide, and I have 3 of them. And I usually put a half a bag to a full, probably a half a bag of peat moss in each of those beds. and then a full bag of peat moss, so the 3.8 cubic feet, into my garden bed because that's substantially bigger. It's more like 20 feet by 5 feet or 6 feet. So I just dump it all in there. And then I take my wheelbarrows of compost, dump it in there. So at this point, there's piles of peat moss, piles of compost, and then I take a cup of the garden tone and I sprinkle it on top evenly. So those are all in there. Then I take my metal rake and I rake it all together. So I don't really mix it ahead of time when I'm working with my raised beds. I just put it all in there and then combine it with that top layer of soil that's already there. So that's how I do that. When I'm working with containers, this is when I usually get my kids involved. I'll take 5-gallon buckets and I'll fill one bucket with compost, one bucket with dirt or soil that I already have, one bucket with peat moss, the bag of garden tone, and I usually add a vermiculite to containers. Vermiculite and perlite are similar. They're like lava ash. They have different purposes, so I'm not super knowledgeable on those, but the reason why I add the vermiculite is because it adds like breathable space. So when you're putting your soil in a container, you want space for the roots to go, for the water to go, for it to kind of breathe. And the vermiculite, the vermiculite or the perlite are the little white pieces that you see in the soil, like store-bought soil has that. It's lighter, just so that it's airier. And I think that's helpful for containers. So I do add that just for the container, for container gardening. And so I'll take, in order, I'll take my shovel, my hand shovel. Well, the kids will. They take the dirt and scoop dirt into a 5-gallon bucket. 1 scoop of dirt, 1 scoop of peat moss, 1 scoop of compost, and then I think like a 1/4 cup of garden tone and like a cup of vermiculite. Depends how big their scoops are. Again, I just eyeball everything. At the very end, the vermiculite sticks out. So, and if you're using that, I would just compare it to some store-bought Miracle Grow or whatever you'd buy at the store and see if it looks similar to that. So if they're perennials that are already planted, so that's how I do the containers. Similar, add the vermiculite. You can add your additional fertilizers if you'd like, whatever you feel comfortable doing. So Amy asks, how does this apply to perennials that are already planted? So for example, in my raised beds, in my ground bed, I already have things like chive, spearmint, sage, lemon balm, oregano, thyme, horseradish, rhubarb. Those are all perennials that will come back every year. So I lay the soil around those plants. You can, on the side of the garden tone, there's also organic fertilizers. I personally use the Espoma brand fertilizers just because that's how I was taught to use those, so I'm familiar with them. But on the back of those, it'll tell you how to fertilize already planted plants. So you'll put the fertilizer like an inch around the base of the plant or something like that. You don't want it to go right against the stem of the plant because that'll burn it or it just won't, it could ruin your plant. So you have to be careful about that. When I'm just mixing everything together like I do in my ground bed and in my raised beds, I don't worry about, I'm not just putting a fertilizer there. It's a mixture, so I don't worry about that so much. So if you're doing a mixture of the soil, peat moss, compost, fertilizer, or any, that's just the way I do it. If you do just bits and pieces of that to start, that's fine. But if you're mixing it all together and then putting it by your perennials, you should be fine. If you're only putting a fertilizer by your perennials, then I would make sure to stay away from the stem of the plant. And they'll have that caution on the back of the bag also to help out with that. I think that is all on the soil. I see Sarah has a link. Oh, is that like the, I'll press the link later. That one tool that like tears up the ground, the claw. Oh, it's not the claw. Okay. We had a claw growing up. I remember that. Okay. I'll make sure to put that link in the slides so that we have access to it after. So I'm going to go back to location. So northeast, my garden's on the northeast side of my house. Okay, I can't wait to find out what that tool is. My garden's on the northeast side of the house. Make sure to pay attention to the trees that might be blocking your garden plot. We do have one big tree, but the garden, where the garden is, we are so fortunate that it gets really good morning and afternoon sun. It's pretty much sunny constantly where the garden is. The rain garden that I was talking about is actually on the southeast side of the house, which is that brighter? Sarah, do you know, I'm getting confused with house plants and outside gardens. And I'm not very great at house plants, but I know the southeast side of the house is super sunny for house plants. But the point is, when you're deciding where to put your garden or your containers, be aware of what kind of sun it gets during certain times of the day. So especially if you're planting, we're talking a lot about veggies, which is what I prefer to talk about because I'm not great with flowers and I'm all about growing your own food. However, I do know that when you plant certain flowers, some plants like morning sun, some plants like afternoon sun. So that's really important to keep that in mind. Plants like mint, plants like, Sarah's terrible with direction too. Plants like mint are good with the shade. There's other plants that are good in the shade, like I think lettuce is good in the shade. There's some other plants that are good in the shade. So check that out and keep that in mind when you're when you're researching what plants you want to grow. This isn't necessarily about location, but since we're talking about sun and things like that, there are cool weather plants and warmer weather plants like your broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. Those like cooler weather. Root veggies, I usually plant in the spring and then again in the fall. So that's a good late harvest. Let's see, mint will always come back. Mint you'll want to plant in a container usually. Lettuce needs shade because my lettuce bolts every year and I'm like, why is this happening? Yeah, okay, lettuce needs shade. Thank you for that note. So that's important to keep in mind when to plant. So usually in August, I think it's August. Yeah. Usually in August, I start researching what plants I need to plant, what plants I need to grow for a fall harvest. So those are usually cooler weather things. Peas also. Pea, well, this isn't a slide either. I told you I could go down rabbit holes here and there. There are plants that are really good for direct sow. So taking the seed and planting it directly outside in the garden, and certain plants that need to be grown ahead of time, like inside, or purchased at a local store. Peas are one that are really easy to just direct sow. You should not ever buy peas from the store. Beans you shouldn't buy from the store. You should be able to grow. You can buy peas or beans at the store. It's just really easy to directly grow them from the ground. Lettuce also, that's one that lettuce is one that I will plant every 10 days. I think I'll harvest a row of the lettuce and then I'll plant another row. So that's a continuous kind of planting that I do with that. What else? Basil, I usually plant directly in the ground. Sometimes I'll start it ahead of time. So keep that in mind also. Let's see. Plants. Okay, we're talking a lot of about plants now. So, okay, Sarah said that you can buy shade cloth to block the sun when it's too hot. Yeah. So I've never used shade cloth, but I've read about it. That's really interesting and helpful. Yeah, that lettuce bolts. Broccoli will bolt also because it's a cold weather crop, cooler weather. Those plants that need the cooler weather, they say to mulch around the base because that'll keep the soil cooler and that'll prevent it from flowering or bolting too soon. Things like if your herbs are bolting, once a plant bolts or flowers, it changes the flavor and it will be bitter usually. So like when my basil starts to bolt late summer, I'll pinch off the flowers. So that takes the energy and stops the energy from flowering and pushes the energy back down into growing more. So
Is that mostly just with herbs, or do other plants do that too?
So I don't know if you'd handle it the same way as like the basil, but the broccoli, I'm not great at broccoli, though that bolts fast for me. Arugula last year bolted so fast. But it's just like what Sarah's talking about. I just it's too hot for it when I like arugula midsummer, and it just doesn't do well midsummer. Lettuce bolts, it'll get really like woody and leggy at the base, and then you'll still see leaves and you'll want to use it, but it just tastes so bitter. And then yellow flowers will come off the top. So it doesn't necessarily work this. I know it doesn't work that way with the lettuce, because the lettuce, once it flowers, it's just too bitter. The basil, once you pick the flowers off the top, it's fine. I still use it. I just pluck the flowers, and it pushes all of the energy down. I'm sure there's
Christina,
other.
can I,
Yeah.
oh, can I add to that? Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is, okay. It's Sarah. I don't know who just asked that, but I'll keep my arugula going for probably far longer than other people, because I'll just keep taking off the flowers, and I'll eat the flowers too. They'll just taste like arugula. It just gets spicier sometimes. But yeah,
Oh.
it does get woody. Yeah, I eat the arugula. I think most things you could eat the flowers of, I would think. But yeah, some people, it's just up to your own taste in terms of the lettuces when they start to bolt, because some people like bitterness, but you'll taste it straight away, whoever asked that question. And then Christina, do you grow garlic
Yes.
or no? So then with garlic, you actually want to cut the flower off, and then that encourages the garlic bulb to grow, and then you grow it several months longer. So if whoever asked that question, if you try growing garlic, that's part of it is to cut off the scape. It's called the scape on a garlic plant, but it's the flower.
Okay, I have a question about that. It's been about 3 years since I grew garlic, but I did grow this year, and I grew hardneck and softneck garlic. Are scapes only on hardneck garlic, or are they on both?
I don't know a lot about the differences, but I think they're on both, because it's when it flowers and then you cut it off. It's just the hardneck and softneck is versus how long I think it signifies how long it stores for, doesn't it?
The hardneck
partly?
yeah, the hardneck is hardier.
Yeah.
The hardneck usually has like 3 or 4 cloves on it, and it has the stem that goes straight through, and the soft neck doesn't have the stem all the way through, and it has like smaller cloves in the middle and bigger on the outside.
Oh, I guess I knew we grew, I'll look it up real quick.
Well, I
would
just
think
planted so
both,
much.
because they both are going to grow a flower.
Yeah, I don't know. It's been a long time since I grew garlic, so I don't know the answer. I don't remember that. I don't remember the answer to that, but I thought I read somewhere that only one of them have the scapes.
Oh, you're right. It's the hardneck.
Is it?
It's
Because
the
I
hardneck
wanted
one.
scapes. So then what happens with the soft neck?
I guess I've never planted softneck, now that you're asking me. It's always I do it on, because I like the scapes because you can eat them. I love every part of garlic.
Me too. Yeah. So I think, so I got some garlic. When I used to plant garlic 3 or 4 years ago, I planted like store-bought garlic to start with, and that soft neck. And then this year I planted a whole bunch of garlic that I got from Groundswell.
That's my favorite.
I know you just posted about that today.
That's where I worked. I used to work there.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I worked there a summer, my first summer back. Yeah. Not with Bruce Michael, but that's how I learned a lot of my Michigan gardening stuff with vegetables.
They're in Zealand, aren't they?
Yeah, on Quincy. They have the best garlic.
That's a great
If anyone
place
likes
to
garlic
work.
or planting garlic, either to eat or to plant. Like they sell like the seed garlic there's a decent chance you're buying Groundswell seed garlic. So
Oh, I didn't know that. I got I got my garlic from Southeast Market, and they they get their food from Groundswell. So
Yeah.
that's how I picked it up. And they have those are hardneck, I think.
Hardneck. Yeah.
So I have a lot of
Yeah.
hardneck. And then I think there's a garlic lady at the Fulton Street Farmers Market in like mid-July. And I think so I haven't planted garlic in 3 years because I keep forgetting to go visit her. And so this year I did visit her and I picked up like a Siberian something and another kind. I have it labeled in the garden bed, but I think I planted a few different varieties, but I'm really excited for those scapes.
They're really good. Yeah.
Yes.
That's the nice thing about garlic. If anyone on the call hasn't grown it, you can use like every part of it. It's super, and you just plant it in the fall and forget about it. So then pretty much. So you can use the scapes, you can use, even if you forget it and it comes up the next year, I still eat it. It's not going to go bad. I mean, you can tell when it's bad when you pull it out of the ground. You can eat the green, obviously so garlic is really a fun crop and a satisfying crop.
Yeah.
You can buy seeds from Groundswell. 8th Day sells them. I wonder if you're talking about Green Wagon, Christina, if they have, I don't know, go to Fulton Street, obviously, because I run Holland, so I can't go, but I think Green
Oh.
Wagon also sells it too.
I don't
But
know.
you honestly can even buy garlic at the store and just plant the cloves.
Yeah.
People say you can't, but it's a garlic seed is just a garlic clove. It's just, they say that, there's no guarantee against pests, or if it's always
Mhm.
better to buy from a farm that's in your growing zone. So
Yeah, that's interesting because the same goes for, although it's trickier, I think, potatoes. Do you know much about growing potatoes? Probably do.
a bit, not a ton. So I did at Groundswell, and then I've grown some here, but last year was really my first successful year growing potatoes. But I do know about growing them.
So could you use store-bought potatoes once they grow the
Yeah.
eye?
Yeah. You just cut them, to cut, you only, like, whatever you plant just has the eye.
Okay.
Like, I
So-
think half the stuff I grew is stuff that I bought to eat, and then it just grew in my pantry, so I planted it.
That's what I have. I have so many potatoes from last year that have eyes growing that I'm about to pop to the ground. Can you plant potatoes in the fall for the next
Ooh.
year? I think I read
I don't,
somewhere
I feel like their ground over winter, when it would start to thaw, would get too wet.
in
I feel
mushy.
there's something about wet. Yeah. Cause we didn't do it, and the farmers I know I don't think they plant in the fall here, and there must be, I'm thinking the ground would get too, I'm just guessing.
Mhm.
Um,
I think I read somewhere that you can, but also it depends on what zone. So it could quite possibly be not our zone. But I was just wondering because potatoes are one of those that you have to get right in the ground. And sometimes it's tricky in the spring because it's rainy and the weather's weird and there's never a great time to get it in the ground. So it would be super convenient to just pop it in the ground in the fall and let it be. So I was just wondering about that.
I guess I really,
Maybe I should try it out this fall and then
Yeah.
report back.
that's right. That's funny. I think it would be more about maybe your soil too. Like if you're, like, we have a clay soil, so ours just holds water.
Mhm.
Like if it froze, and then I feel like that would have something. So then I would just have like rotten potatoes,
Yeah.
like rotten potato seeds in the ground. Although honestly, I plant garlic in that, but you don't, garlic only goes like down to your first, like your knuckle, basically. It doesn't, or not even that. It doesn't even go that far in. So it wouldn't sit in water as much as a potato might.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a good, maybe I'll plant a corner and see what happens.
Let's do that. I think that, so potatoes are, in my opinion, potatoes are a super cool plant to grow. I think I first tried like 4 or 5 years ago to plant potatoes, but it was in a shady area and potatoes need the sun. And then ever since then, or after that, I planted it in a like a 4x4. So I planted it deep in one of those, like you can plant potatoes in like a potato bag they have. I was never successful with that kind of thing. I built it out of wood. And I just wasn't successful with that style. So I planted my potatoes the last 2 years in my ground garden. And so potatoes are really cool because they don't grow down and they don't grow up, they grow out. So you have to kind of like mound them. And they need a certain, I don't know which one of those three that they need, but they need more of one thing. Oh, when I was researching companion gardening, like I do every year, and it said, so I rotate all of my beds, my 4 garden beds, and it said the first bed to plant peas and I don't know where I put my paper, peas and not beans, peas and something else. And then the next year plant potatoes or tomatoes. Potatoes and tomatoes can't be planted together because they attract the same bug. I mean, you can plant them together, but if you get that disease, then both those crops are gone. And then the year after that, plant, I think it was root veggies, because the root veggies like whatever grubs the potatoes or tomatoes attract. So I thought that was really interesting, kind of which order to rotate crops, because I had a conundrum where do I put my potato bed and where do I put my tomato bed if I only have these 4 beds and the whole companion gardening, and it's a headache every year. So I thought that was really interesting when I found that out when I was writing out my garden plans this past week. So if you are looking to plant a bigger garden, look into companion gardening and what you can plant nearby. Like the Native Americans planted corn, squash, and beans all together because the combo of those 3, did I plant, I might have posted this in the, this may have been in that dirt video that I posted in the Facebook event, but the combo of the 3, corn, squash, and beans, provided all of the right nutrients, like the perfect trifecta for the soil. So companion gardening is super important in that way, that you're leaving the soil with certain nutrients for the next year's crop if you plant it correctly. Wow, I timed this pretty good. Advice and questions. I'm so happy you're here, Sarah. You're a wealth of information. Sarah does run the Plant It Forward Grand Rapids group. So if you are interested further in plant questions, plant sharing, things like that, join the Plant It Forward Grand Rapids group if you haven't already. Yes. Oh yeah, I did see you in there, Brianna. So yeah.
I do have a quick question. I'm wondering if you guys have any tips on, like I've heard to trim off the first few branches on tomato plants. Are there any other things like that to kind of help vegetables grow and produce more?
So Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but tomato plants, they say to pinch off that the tomato plant grows like it'll grow a branch and then often it'll have this like this one growing between that's the one you're supposed to break off, because if you don't break it off, it'll create like a new plant, and then it'll get like too carried away, and your energy, the energy for the plant will be going in all these different directions. So you want to break off that shoot off so that the energy is contained in just that one main stem. So that's my understanding with the tomato plants. More about the tomato plants, I've read that you break off so tomatoes are interesting. I've read you plant them horizontally in the ground, and that makes the plant stronger. It'll make a thicker stem for the plant, because eventually it'll grow upwards towards the sun. But when you plant it sideways, because all those furry things that are on the stem, those are roots. So those will grow into the ground. And then once it grows up, you break off. There could be controversy on this, but they say to break off the bottom 6 inches of stem so that there's airflow throughout your bed of tomatoes. And then you break the little suckers that grow between the branches. So that's my understanding of tomatoes.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And part of it too, for those 2 low stems, or I've honestly kind of got more casual with it when it starts to grow. I just keep popping off the lower stems, because also part of it is tomatoes, like tomato, why am I blanking? Not tomato blight. Is it tomato blight? Which
Yeah.
spreads super fast. Like almost everybody has it. It's like if your neighbor, it spreads far. So if a neighbor, like, I forget how far down the block from you has it, you're going to get it. And part of it is it spreads through water, and tomatoes can be really sensitive with how you water them. So also trimming off those lower leaves, it's because water hits the ground and splashes up on them. And then it's a faster way to spread that blight, because once it's in your soil, it's pretty much in your soil permanently. It's just a matter of how fast it hits your tomatoes. And it's fine. You can still eat the tomato and you can still get a full tomato crop, and it just depends how fast that blight hits your tomatoes. But I've also heard that and that's with other things too, with like, in terms of airflow and the water splashing up. Because if you get, well, water splashing obviously spreads disease, but it also, if it's a crop like, I do this even with lettuces, but also with stuff that, heads of lettuce, but chard and all that, if it gets too wet and you don't keep trimming, especially those lower leaves, even if you're not going to eat them, you're going to get slugs. Tomatoes don't get slugs, but anything where it's too wet and it stays too wet and you don't get airflow through, mulch does, like some people garden just into straight mulch or into straight, like on, or plastics, although you can argue different things with plastic, but our groundswell, it's still a certified organic, and we did use black plastic at the time for tomatoes, because they're easy, but at the same time, they're finicky. To me anyway.
What about a soaker system? Like
yeah. Yep. I'm actually kind of a lazy gardener. So I'm too lazy to put like a soaker system around. But yeah, groundswell, we had like the tube. Yeah, like the under.
Or drip system.
The drip system. That's really, because then tomatoes really like their roots watered. They really don't like to be sprayed on the tomatoes and all the leaves, and a lot of vegetable stuff. That's a really easy way to spread disease. I still have an overhead sprinkler. I don't do, but drip would be better. I'm just lazy, and I know I'm going to destroy my drip every year because I don't properly winterize it. So
same.
we all have to make do with what is realistic for each of us. And like, if you go to my garden, it's full of weeds, because I just don't worry about weeds. Weeds help your plants like stay upright. So if they're not taking over your plant, then it's not a problem. I'm not like the pretty gardener. I have I eat from my garden. So
That makes me feel better, because my garden is like that too.
Yeah. As far as I know, Kelsey, there's not a way to get rid of blight from the soil. I don't even think, it's just rotating crops is always a good thing to do, but I think once blight is in there, it's just in there. I don't even think solarizing, where you put like the tarp on and like kill everything off. I don't think that kills blight, but I could be wrong. I've just come to the understanding that once you have it, you just have it, and it's just how fast it hits your tomatoes. I think if you grow heirloom tomatoes, that helps. I mainly grow heirlooms.
How about
Dang it.
how about root veggies? Do root veggies get blight?
No, I don't. Well, I shouldn't say no. But I feel like everything gets something. But there is something with I'm
that's
not going to remember, but it's just good to rotate in general, because there's stuff that like there's something with cauliflower that's really hard to get out of your soil. And then anything in that category, it's going to affect those crops, which is why I just keep looking at her, dang it.
What about marigolds? I planted marigolds around all my beds last year because that's supposed to help detract. Is it just aphids?
No, I think it does attract other stuff. Marigolds are the ones that I plant a ton of marigolds, but for some reason, the really big, tall marigolds work much better in my garden than the short marigolds.
Okay.
So eighth day, we got marigold transplants from eighth day last year, and they honestly grew so big. Todd, my husband, was like, they're kind of terrifying. It was like a massive marigold plant. But for some reason in our garden, the taller, I think one's like a French version, one's an English, I don't know. The taller ones do much better with pest control. Yeah, I plant them at the end of all of my rows and like around, just kind of random staggering throughout the garden to help with pests.
Yeah. So that's one way, Kelsey, that you can try and do some preventative stuff. What about neem oil for like powdery mildew? I get powdery mildew every year. So I started like breaking off powdery mildews on squash. So I started breaking off the extra leaves, because if there's not enough airflow, then the powdery mildew will grow, or it'll spread quicker. But I still get powdery mildew. Do you have that issue, Sarah?
I do, and I think that's another one that it's really hard to, it doesn't, well, it can affect your crop obviously, but honestly, I don't use like anything in my garden at all. I use kale, like the kelp fertilizer, and then I'll use like compost from somewhere. But in terms of spraying, I don't do anything. I just take off the leaves that have what I see. So the same thing with squash. I got powdery mildew fairly early last year, and I just kept taking off the leaves that had it. And I did get squash. So I'm probably not the best for like, what can I use on this? Because I really don't use anything. So I just take it off. Thank you. I've been able to still grow tomatoes. Yeah, you can grow a lot. It's just what, yeah, I just don't, I guess I'm mainly organic, but I also, even organic stuff I don't use. Some of the organic stuff is pretty harsh, even though it's organic. And I eat right off the plant all the time, and I just want to be able to put it in my mouth in the garden, so I don't use anything. I'm a plucker, so if I see a tomato worm, or the hornworm, I'll just pluck and throw in the woods. I just pluck off what's bad. And then if a plant is taken over, or it's really dead or dying out, I just rip out the plant and throw it in the woods. Or some things like the blight, one of the, or powdery mildew, some of them they say to throw away, like don't put in your compost pile. Because you're
Yeah,
just going to get that in your compost soil, and then you're going to spread it. It doesn't like kill over
the powdery
winter.
mildew.
Yeah.
I always
Yeah.
put that, I always toss that. I don't put that in the compost. Anything that I see is diseased, I don't put in compost. That's a
Yeah.
good, yes, that's a good
So
reminder.
Kelsey, your raised bed, if it's wood, I don't know if powdery mildew can stay in wood, but it's also, again, like if your neighbor has a garden and they have it, it's airborne. So it's gonna spread over to your plant, even if you fixed it. Um,
Yeah, it
But yeah,
sounds like
keep,
I'm just kind of SOL with that. But seems
It's
like I've been able
frustrating.
to. Yeah, but I mean, I think, yeah, the fungicide has worked, but I live in the city too, so that makes I think a big difference because there's just not obviously lots of air. If it's airborne, then I'm just gonna get it, I think, regardless.
Yeah, powdery mildew is tricky. I have so many things that I want to say, but we are at the very end. One thing that I do want to say, I posted pictures in the Facebook event of my garden last year. I bought some cattle panels that go from my raised beds to my ground bed. And that's where I grow my squash. So I found it really helpful to utilize vertical gardening to make more use of the ground space in my garden, because the squash tend to take up so much space that if I can have it grow over like an arbor sort of thing, that frees up a lot more space for me to grow more food. So if you have access to a trailer or something really big that you could purchase cattle panels, I got it from like Tractor Supply for $20 each, and I have 2 of them. That has been like a game changer for my garden. So I highly recommend that. There's so many other things. There's so much about gardening. But we're going to leave it at this. So the website, I have just 2 links on it. I'll have the link to this Zoom, and then I'll have the slides that can be editable, and I'll put the links that are in the chat here into that onto that website, and then I can add anything extra. You can edit the Google Docs, things like that. So this is just it's a hidden page, so you can just access it through this link. It's through my website, but you can't find it on my website. It's just a hidden page there. So make sure that you pop on there and add your tips there. Any other questions you can put in the Facebook event. And I really hope that your gardens are super awesome this year, and let us know if we can help out with any of your other questions or anything. Sarah, you've been super helpful. Kelsey, Trinity, Brianna, and mom. Thank you for participating. And Amy, she was having bad connection, but I'm so pleased that you've been here tonight, and I am happy for the successful discussion. So pop your questions in the Facebook event or on this site, and we will help each other out this season. So that's it. If anyone else has anything to say, now's the time. Otherwise, we can sign off. I appreciate you guys.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Have a good night.
You too. See you guys. I don't know how to end this.